I'm going to start with my personal story. These are my parents. My parents migrated from Peru to the United States in the late 1978. And I was born in the United States, and in the United States we have something called birthright, which means that if you're born in the United States, you're a US citizen. And there's two events in particular that have shaped my life. One of them was in 1986, when Reagan legalized 3 million migrants. And this was 28 years ago. It's important to note this because it's been over a quarter of a century in the United States since we've had immigration reform passed by a very extremely right-wing president. And the second event is NAFTA that was passed in 1994. I was a teenager at the time, and the promise that Clinton made was that there would no longer be borders for market capital. And yet that same year, there began to be a wall erected at the US-Mexico border. And today, this is one of the most dangerous places to cross. In fact, it's the most militarized border in the history of the United States. Also important to note that 83% of migrants to the United States are Latinos, meaning of Latino origin. And so, growing up in the 90s, for me, I witnessed a growing cultural narrative against migrants and against Latinos in particular. We're the largest minority in the United States, yet we're very invisible from pop culture, we're invisible from mainstream media. And the anti-immigrant movement created a narrative around fear, really positioning immigrants as though we were taking American jobs. And they were extremely successful at this. I mean, so successful that in '94 you had the first state-based anti-immigrant law. And by 2010 in Arizona, that trend just expanded and expanded. In fact, the anti-immigrants were very successful in creating a narrative based on hate and extremism. Today, we face over 1,000 deportations a day in the United States. That's mothers, fathers, our neighbors are separated by immigration policy at the rate of 1,000 a day. And so if you wonder how it is that we arrived to this place, it's really because of cultural narratives. It's really because of a narrative that was circulated throughout the US media over 20 years. And we now are today in a place where we look at migrants through the lens of punishment and criminality. As artists, though, we could also use these tactics. We can use the tactics of culture shifting to also position new ideas. Now, I've been someone who's worked for a long time in the social justice space, and the way that I approach my work is by understanding what's missing from the space of action. And in the space of action is where laws are made. Right? In the United States, we have a majority white male Congress that makes laws about everything from immigration to access to abortion. And, in the action space, often we are in a reactionary frame, meaning we're always against the no, right? We say, stop deportations. No, I'm not illegal. And we often get stuck there. And so the question that I think is very important for artists in particular is, what does the yes look like? How do we create another kind of cultural narrative that's about the kind of society we want to build? And not just stay in the reactive space, but also move towards the visionary space. And if you look at also the way in which the anti-migrants successfully created a culture of punishment, and also, a prison industry, really, migrants are the fastest growing population in US prisons. It's because they began with an idea, and that idea over 20 years was normalized, and then it became policy. And so now today we're in a place where we're fighting bad policy, and yet there's not enough investment and not enough resources to looking at how artists can shift ideas. And this is really the work that I try to do, is to examine what are these core ideas that we need to disrupt in order to have good policy, and understanding that this is a long-term strategy. This is something that happens over 10, 20 years. And so this is my attempt at my theory of change. So first is that I'm looking at art as a way to build alternative ecosystems and alternative, really, systems that can compete for real power. So first, let me talk about cultural inequality in the United States. So I'm a Latina. In my home state of California, we are 40% of the population, okay? If you look at children, they are over 50% being born, Latinos being born. And yet we receive less than 2% of art money. Okay, so we're extremely excluded, and if you look at why there's a lack of our narratives, it's also because there is institutionalized and systematic racism happening in art and culture. So the pipeline is broken. Not to mention that if you look at schools in communities of color, there's no art programs, right? So there's this magical intersection that happens between the artists and the movement. And I really want to say that we have to acknowledge what the movement is doing. In the United States, the immigrant rights movement is among the strongest in the world. It's led by undocumented migrants who are coming out of the closet and revealing their status, and who are doing civil disobedience and occupations in the offices of our elected officials. So there's this magic space that happens, and in order for that space to thrive, what do you need? Well, first you need a mutual respect for the artists and for the movement, and understanding that in order for us to work together, there has to be a mutual benefit. Second, you need infrastructure, because we need a way to build deep and long-lasting relationships so that artists who want to work in social movement have the support that they need, and especially that they have economic opportunity, because our labor as artists matters. And then in the creative process, we have to ask ourselves questions of power, right? How are we empowering the migrant community that we're working with? Not just in an extractive way. I think often in the art world and even in the social practice world, there's a very extractive tendency, which means that the artist often walks away with the creative capital. And that's not movement building, that's not power shifting. We have to look at how can we create regenerative models where we regenerate and we put back in, and we look at how are we shaping and changing the conditions for immigrants every day by the actions that we do. And that means working with migrant artists. It means really being in a co-creative process. And finally is the kind of impact that we're going to make, right? And Roberta Uno said this yesterday, which is how do we create a shared future, right? And we have to understand what kind of impacts can our work do, and ultimately, what is the long-term strategy that we have here, and what kind of shifts can we create? And so these are things that I think about. It can be a little wonky, but I really love thinking about this in my process. And so this is a project. I'm going to show you now an example of this in the 3 minutes I have left. So first is that in the American imagination, the US border is a metaphor of US law, right? And so if someone crosses that border, they're threatening the sovereignty of the United States. And so Migration is Beautiful was an invitation for the public to consider a world without borders. The monarch butterfly is the insect with the longest migration route. It starts in Mexico, goes through USA, and then through Canada and back. And so using the symbol of the monarch butterfly as a symbol for the human right to move. I was really inspired by the Black is Beautiful campaign, which emerged in the 1960s, which was really an invitation for us to think in our imagination, how do we change the fact that we've been taught to think that blackness is ugly, right? And so we were fighting for, against segregation, and we were fighting for our civil rights, but we also had to fight a war in our mind. And this is exactly what I'm trying to do, is to think about how do we talk about our human condition, that migration, we've been migrating since the beginning of time. And let's also consider, my mother, for example, and our families, our migrant families, the immense amount of courage that it takes to leave your home country, to cross a border, to face off with narcos, to face off with the police, to face horrible conditions, whether it's in the Mediterranean Sea or in the hottest desert in Arizona, where since 2000, there's been 6,000 deaths at the US-Mexico border. Mediterranean Sea, there's been 22,000 since the year 2000. And so think about the immense amount of courage. And in reality, migrants are heroes, right? That migrants represent the human will to survive. And so I created projects where people could participate. I partnered with national organizations in the United States, such as the National Educators Association, to spread the meme. Teachers were distributed these to put up in their classrooms. And collaborating with movement groups, and the message just spread and spread. Here you have day laborers in Los Angeles painting the butterfly right before a big immigrant rights rally. This is in Philadelphia, where mothers use the butterfly to cover an ICE building. ICE is Immigration Customs Enforcement, and they covered the building with butterflies. And this is in DC, New York, I mean, just everywhere, really empowering work, collaborating with migrant groups on the ground, and then finally thinking about how do we disseminate this among our artist community. Together with 100 other artists, including The Roots, Robert Redford, R.E.M., Shepard Fairey, we wrote a letter to Congress and we said, creativity, immigration is a cultural imperative. And we were able to really disseminate, not just through artists, but through movements, the idea that migration is not just our human right, but that as a migrant community, we stand for the resilience and the determination of migrants. Thank you so much.
I would hope that more could look at this in a more positive way, so we could see the solutions, could see people. I mean, as I am a Roma, I have often tried to hide myself when I was a child and grow up. I played many roles because I was afraid, because I know there was no positive picture of Roma at the time, and still not today. So I tried to hide my identity. Do you think if we can change the mainstream to look more positive on migration, that asylum seekers, migrants, could lose up, not to be afraid to show who you really are? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I've been very inspired by the undocumented, unafraid movement in the United States, where young people began to come out on YouTube and in rallies and say, we're undocumented and we're unafraid. And I really think it's important. This is why I think we need to be migrant-led, that migrants need to be at the forefront of our projects. We need to incorporate and work very collaboratively with migrant voices, because they should be leading, and it's really their stories when we come out. When we come out of the closet, I mean, Harvey Milk said this during the LGBT liberation movement, is that when you come out, you completely disempower your enemy. And so I think as a strategy, it's extremely important to move away from victimization into a place of empowerment.
I agree with you. I did that.